Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Sherry, Simon, Salah, Basalamah. How are you?
Hi.
Great.
Hello.
Welcome to our fifth and last conversation in the two-day webinar that we've organized. The conversation topic for your particular session is Thinking Translationally, Conversations Across Disciplines, Objects and Spaces. I'll just very quickly introduce the two of you for our audience. Salah Basalamah is Associate Professor at the School of Translation and Interpretation, University of Ottawa. His fields of research include the philosophy of translation, translation rights, social and political philosophy, post-colonial, cultural and religious studies, as well as Western Islam and Muslims. He's the author of Le droit de traduire, une politique culturelle pour la mondialisation at the University of Ottawa Press, and he translated from English into French Fred A. Reid's Shattered Images at VLB on the ancient and contemporary history of Syria. Since 2014, he teaches a multidisciplinary PhD seminar on the diversity of Canadian Muslims at the Institute of Canadian and Aboriginal Studies at the University of Ottawa. He is currently working on a forthcoming book about the philosophy of translation and its various applications in the fields of humanities and social science. Sherry Simon is Distinguished University Research Professor in the French Department at Concordia University. She has published widely in the areas of intercultural and translation studies, most recently exploring the cultural history of linguistically divided cities and translation sites. Among her recent publications are Translating Montreal, Episodes in the Life of a Divided City, Cities in Translation, Intersections of Language and Memory, and Translation Sites, a Field Guide. She has edited or co-edited numerous volumes, including Translation Effects, The Shaping of Modern Canadian Culture with Kay Maisie and Von Flotto. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a member of the Académie des Lettres du Québec. Welcome, both of you. When you like, you can start. Sherry and or Salah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll start by thanking the FUSP and the NIDA Center for Advanced Research on Translation, including Stefano Arduini and Siri Nergard and all the collaborators for this wonderful opportunity to actually to rediscover a person I have been crossing many times during my stay in Montreal as a student in a neighboring university. And I've actually never had the opportunity to get to know Sherry as much as I did during the past few weeks. And it was just a wonderful experience to do that. And I hope that this session today is going to be even get us further in that interconnaissance, how know each other even more, especially on the level of ideas. So I think what I want to say is maybe just start with the warning, or maybe disclaimer, kind of saying that this conversation may seem too theoretical or abstract to some people, but the aim here is to get down to more concrete, urgent things. I think at the end of the day. My approach personally is phenomenological, and I'm gonna let Sherry in a few seconds tell us about hers. But my approach is phenomenological, with transdisciplinary conceptualization of translation, meaning that what I'd like to do is actually, engage in a transdisciplinary translational position where we decenter our vantage point from translation studies only into diverse fields of knowledge. And that's what I mean by transdisciplinary. And as a result, this would lead us to a continuous redefinition of translation. And obviously, this is going to situate me right in line with my research program that I've been kind of working on for a while now, which is this notion of philosophy of translation that I'll be kind of concluding with at the end. So just to start off, I'd like to start off with this. I don't know if you've noticed, Sherry, but so many times during the conversation that preceded us, we've heard this, your expression that you came up with of thinking translationally. It came up several times yesterday and today. And so maybe the question I'd like to start off with, and as an introduction to our topic, is, I mean, how did you come up with, could you please tell us how, on earth such an idea came to your mind?
Thanks, Salah, for everything. Thanks for your beginning remarks, which of course I echo. This opportunity to begin this friendship, to continue this friendship is wonderful. And I think Siri would approve, because Siri has said all along that she, these conversations which come out of our actual encounters and friendly gestures are really particularly valuable. And in that light, I would like to thank Siri for everything she's done, as well as Stefano and all the others who were involved in this wonderful initiative. I'm just wondering, Salah, how about, would you just like to show the next slide? And then maybe we could just, because I think this is going to be the structure of our discussion. I will answer your question, and then maybe we could take away the thing, because we don't really need it. So Salah asked me what translational thinking means to me, or thinking translationally, but together, and especially Salah came up with these 4 items that for him were the most important. And I was so grateful, because I believe they really are, they're going to structure our discussion, but I think they very much structure the way we both think. So let me just read them, and this is going to be the structure of our conversation. So translational thinking means viewing the world through the lens of 4 main principles: a search for connections, a conscience or consciousness of the permanence of change, an openness to difference, and an aspiration to social justice. So I think that's quite easy for us to keep in our minds. So maybe we don't need that anymore. And but it's brilliant. And if you've had a chance to write them down, that's great. Now, as for coming up with the term, I think that people have spontaneously come up with the idea of thinking translationally. For me, it means using translation, and again, whatever that means, translation, because as you just said, we're in a constant search for new definitions of translation, for new definitions of thinking translationally. And just as you say that translation points to a situation of permanent change, so our thinking and theory is involved in permanent change. So we always have provisional definitions, and then we go on to modify them. I am especially attracted to your first item, the search for connections. And I think that I'm just going to briefly, in response to your question and in response to the way of starting off the discussion, talk about what, how this search for connection might structure thinking translation. So just as a preface, actually, thinking translationally to me is using translation as a way of thinking about other things. So what does that mean? So it means thinking about other disciplines. How do other disciplines use translation to think about themselves? And one of the most, let's say, eloquent expressions of this, I thought I take from Dipesh Chakrabarty from the beginning of the 2000s when he wrote his book, Provincializing Europe. And I'm just going to quote a bit of what he says. He says, the problem of capitalist modernity cannot any longer be seen simply as a sociological problem of a historical transition, but must be seen as a problem of translation as well. There was a time before scholarship itself became globalized, when the process of translating diverse forms, practices, and understandings of life into universalist political theoretical categories of deeply European origin seemed to most social scientists an unproblematic proposition. That which was considered an analytical category such as capital, was understood to have transcended the fragment of European history in which it may have originated. Okay, so what he means by that is the very categories with which we think are in fact categories that we must put into question, and we must put into question translationally. So where does this notion of capital come from, and why should it be applied universally without taking into consideration competing categories that could originate in different contexts? So as a historian, he understood translation to be a deeply unsettling framework with which to question the very enterprise of thought. And then you have someone like Barbara Cassin, who we've mentioned over the course, and Brian Baer mentions Barbara Cassin in relation to his own genealogical rethinking of the history of translation studies, but which would also be a rethinking of the history of philosophy, which is what Barbara Cassin has done. And I think for many, many of us, that book and its project to show translation as the very basis of philosophical thinking, not an afterthought, but the very basis. Just in the same way that we look at Roman Jakobson's definition of translation as the very basis of linguistic activity and not an afterthought. So these are ways in which, thinking translationally is a way of thinking across disciplines, and there would be many other examples of such. But okay, thinking translationally as a way of thinking about connections that create knowledge. Connections also of networks of solidarity. So in my first book on gender, I was thinking of translation, the connections that translation makes are very much translations of networks of solidarity. In relation to work on the city, I was looking at how translation connects or does not make connections across the city. So different ways of thinking about connections. Warm connections, cool connections, connections that create differences, connections that leave differences on their own. Connections that create the historical identity of place. So that's been my last project about translation sites. I'll now turn it back over to you, Salah, with this emphasis on this very lovely first item that you identified as being part of Thinking Translationally, connection. So what is connection? How does translation studies think connections? And how are these connections across different disciplines, but also across spaces and objects? So why don't you
Absolutely.
continue?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sherry. Yeah, for me, translational thinking is first a matter of displacement and movement. So the notion of spaces is kind of basic in here, not only etymologically, obviously, but in terms of, you know, this thinking in terms of movement, and the connections have to be in the move. So, but moving is not wandering; it is targeted, I believe. It connects the disparate and heterogeneous, like the articulations of actor networks, if you like. Translation is a kind of energy, I believe, that links various entities, whether by virtue of their commonalities, opposition, or otherwise. For me, translation here is like, or translational thinking is like tying flux that creates an improbable temporary association toward a common goal. And as a direct result of these connections, of this conception of movements that brings various entities to be connected, even for as short a time as an instant, translation is that evanescent locus of the ephemeral. So thinking translationally here for me becomes the consciousness of transient trajectories and fleeting networks. It is the, if you'd like, the ability to perceive the brief alignments of entities that would otherwise not be perceptible as connected. So translational thinking is then the capacity of perceive the transitory links that may underlie the unrelated. I personally see this kind of perceptiveness not only in the works of Bruno Latour and colleagues, but more so in those of Latour's first mentor, Michel Serres. The figure of Hermes is a case in point, the god of trade, crossroads in communication. In The Parasite, Michel Serres, Hermes represents a system of polycenters in the shape of a network and multiple connections, whereby the third party is the parasite or the necessary included mediator. So maybe you remember also one of the, I think the fifth volume of his Hermes, he talks about the Northwestern Passage. And interestingly enough, it goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific through Canada, through Canada's north, right? Which is through all these different, how do you say that? Les banquises, all through these icebergs, you know. And obviously, it's not a direct way, you know, through this landscape. It has to go through all these different, trajectories that are very random. And for him, it is this kind of metaphor of connection between all knowledges, all fields of knowledge, that he has been such a brilliant example of someone who does his, it looks like wandering, but it is targeted, yes, despite the fact that the trajectory is completely convoluted and indirect. So, this is, I think this idea of connection and in consciousness of impermanence of things, I think Michel Calon has expressed it very well in this quote, if I may read it very quickly. He said, considered from a very general point of view, this notion, translation, according to actor network theory, by the way, this notion, translation, postulates the existence of a single feed of significations, concerns, and interests, the expression of a shared desire to arrive at the same result. Though translation recognizes the existence of divergences and differences that cannot be smoothed out, it nevertheless affirms the underlying unity between elements distinct from one another. Translation involves, and here's the punchline, translation involves creating convergences and homologies by relating things that were previously different. So I would just conclude with those words about the first part, combining, if you'd like, the two first principles of connection and openness to difference, connection and the awareness of permanence of change.
Thanks. I will continue with Michel Serres. We didn't mention him previously in our conversations, but I'm remembering that Michel Serres has written these beautiful books, one about angels. And actually, in my last book, I do have a small section on annunciations, which I have become very, very fond of as translational acts. The annunciation of the angel to Mary, who receives the news of her new role as a mother of Christ. And he also, Michel Serres, has a book on bridges. So maybe this could be my bridge to a particular example that I've been fascinated with over the years, which is the Bridge of Mostar. And here, maybe I could introduce a more conflictual angle to the conversation, which is perhaps slightly absent from some of the more philosophical, like Michel Serres. I'm not sure. You can tell me about that. But the Bridge of Mostar is a very, very beautiful structure from the 16th century. And it connects the two parts of the city, one more Bosnian and the other more Croatian. And this bridge was destroyed during the Yugoslav war, and it has been rebuilt as a symbol because it's such a beautiful structure. But in fact, the two parts of the city continue to operate very, very separately. So you have a bridge which is more symbolic than real. That is, it does not bridge. It does not do what bridges are supposed to do, which is bring two parts together. And we know that the bridge is an interesting and at the same time a problematic figure in translation studies. And also the fact that what has happened along with the rebuilding of the bridge is that the languages that are spoken in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia, have fragmented to the point where once languages that were considered mutually understandable now require translation. So it's as if this bridge, the Bridge of Mostar, represents very problematic forms of connection, a connection between two parts of the city that do not really live a common life. And that reminds me of your beautiful concept of civic translation. So maybe we want to, it doesn't perform the civic role of translation, which is to ensure that things will will go well, that there will be harmony between those, or at least, well, you'll define, you'll tell me what civic translation means. It means at least functional or awarenesses of differences that can be navigated and negotiated. It doesn't do that. And on the other hand, it heightens the awareness of small differences. So whereas the small differences and the proximate differences of that site in southern former Yugoslavia, today Bosnia, are now heightened to the point where these differences are in the forefront. The same differences were in the past relegated to the background and were not considered significant differences. So now they're both differences in the spatial realm and differences in the linguistic realm. These languages are now different. So so connections, so I'm coming back to the theme of connections, whose significance themselves change over time. So these connections cannot be made once and for all. They are subject to the political circumstances which allow them or not to function. Do you think that that refers back to your notion of civic translation?
Yeah, well, yes, because that's the kind of situation that we find, in fact, in many locales. And interestingly enough, because I've been on that bridge, I've visited it, and it was rebuilt by the Turks, by the way, and not any of the parties on site, but by the Turks, because it was built in the 16th century by the Ottomans at the time, right. And they wanted to kind of, for their own, glory, rebuild it. But when I went over there, I mean, you can't imagine how crowded it was. I mean, people coming from everywhere of the world, and you can't see any Bosnians or Croatians over there. So it's exactly the kind of ground, if you'd like, where civic or citizen translation is called upon to act, because it is something that needs to be willful. It is an engagement. It is an activist duty, to an ethical activist duty towards the locality that is, at stake, where the connection is not happening, actually, despite the neighborhood. And so the idea here is that it's a willfulness or willingness to reconnect what is not connected. And in that sense, it is the application at the same time of translational thinking, which is, again, this energy that ties together, or that's a tying flux of what is unrelated or what is disconnected. And again, as you said, this is a transient situation. It doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen, regularly. It is not something that we can ensure all the time, but it happens whenever there is this energy put into it. So it is not haphazard, it is something that needs to be, put into motion with a willingness, with a target in mind, actually. So yeah, so I believe that citizen translation cannot exist without the disparities that pre-exist to it. And yes. Fragmentation is something that that is, if you'd like to use the the terms that Cobus-Mare loves to use in terms of thermodynamics and so on. It is entropy. So fragmentation is a natural thing. But I think what is interesting, which is something that also Cobus-Mare has mentioned in his writings, is the ability of creating negentropy, which is the resistance to entropy, and to reconnect things together and retie them together. But in order to do that, we need to have an openness to difference, because if we don't have this, there is no way that any connection could take place. And in that sense, I join wholeheartedly what Vicente Rafael has said in the previous session about the kind of the basicness of translational thinking, I believe, in our lives. It's not coincidental that he chose this title, I think, because how basic and foundational, I think, translational thinking is.
I'm going to jump right into, you're talking now openness to difference, so we're kind of on our number 3, and I very much approve and join with you in emphasizing the ethics of translation and the desire to translate. I think that's so important, and I've always said this in my classes. There is untranslatability is a question of the desire and belief. So you can translate what you desire and wish to translate. That's where it comes down. It comes down to desire, will, political will, personal will. That's also the reason that I'll just share this anecdote very quickly, why I hate the movie Lost in Translation, which seems to me to be the perfect embodiment of what I consider to be sort of the melancholic, apathetic refusal or lack of desire to translate. So Lost in Translation takes place in a hotel in Tokyo, and you have these Americans who are there, who are faced with this opaque and exotic world which takes place outside their windows, and they just couldn't give a darn. They're so taken up with their own problems, and they just couldn't give a darn about the world that's out there. And I contrast in this latest book I'll just mention, I contrast this Lost in Translation to another hotel, which is the Grand Budapest Hotel, which is Wes Anderson's film, which is, to me, a profoundly translational movie and a profoundly translational hotel. And the difference is a difference of affect. It's a difference of engagement, of desire, of being in a world of diving into cultural difference, of trying to understand it, just engaging with it at a very much an affective level. And I think I might actually end up liking the movie Lost in Translation just because it encapsulates so beautifully that affect that I don't like, which is this profound sort of melancholic, depressive, culturally inflected, because they're Americans, of course, refusal to engage with difference. So that's a very trivial kind of example of the refusal to be open to difference, but it allows us to understand that it is a question of desire, education, understanding, political motivation, ethics, sort of a sense of what should be done and why we should engage with difference. And because the time is going on, I think this might be the moment where we should share our common political problem here in Quebec, which is a recent legislation which echoes French legislation regarding the prohibition of wearing religious insignia. And so that means the headscarf, it mainly centered on the headscarf, although it refers to kippas and other forms of religious
belonging,
adherence.
Yeah.
So both Salah and I have identified this, what we think is profoundly misguided legislation, as a translational problem. So Salah, would you like to continue on that?
Yeah, maybe a little more abstractly in the beginning, but I'll come to that. So for me, just to tackle my third point, I was going to say that it's so translational thinking, I think in that sense, is also implies a disposition to consider the multiple in all its varieties. The multiple then means unmistakably the acknowledgement of difference. Not only in translation made of difference, but it also actually produces difference. To think translationally would then require that one be open to difference in its multiplicity. So because there is more than one to consider. So in that sense, Paul Ricoeur too notices this way of thinking difference and plurality through the prism of translation. He says in The Just, by the way, translation is from beginning to end the remedy for plurality in a regime of dispersion and confusion. Interestingly, he says a remedy for plurality. So I'd like to come to that. But in line with all the paradoxes translation implies, I hear in translation as a remedy for plurality the paradox of the pharmacon, as described by Derrida. So this kind of, undecidable object again, that it is the remedy but the poison at the same time. So beyond abstraction, I think difference also means taking into account the alterity. So what the German Romantics concept of Bildung taught us is that translation is first about the encounter of the other, that development cannot happen without decentering oneself toward another, and that the balance of translation is located between narcissism and alienation. It cannot be either of them, but it has to be somewhere in between. So the whole hermeneutic tradition has been leading us toward the social dimension of translation, not only as a situated activity, just like we've seen in the sociology of translation, but also as a gauge of relational management, if you'd like. So in that sense, I think that Paul Ricoeur, again, in an even older article of his about Europe, said at some point, "Reflections on a New Ethos of Europe" is the title of his article. He considered translation as a model for European integration, whose, I quote, "potential extends very far, right into the heart of the ethical and spiritual life of individuals and peoples." He continues by saying, I quote again, "In meaning, one can speak of an ethos of translation, whose goal would be to repeat on a cultural and spiritual level the gesture of linguistic hospitality. So the association here of ethics and ethos, interestingly, with the concept of translation is not coincidental. So in fact, Ricoeur's two volumes, The Just and Reflection on the Just, as translated in English, are full of references to the concept of translation. So if translation is a remedy for plurality, it may be because humanity not only cannot escape its being in connection with everything surrounding, but also because humanity is in desperate need to aspire, although very clumsily so far, toward balance and fair relationships. In other words, towards social justice. So this is exactly not only the entry point, but the conclusion that you and I have reached while discussing that legislation in the Quebec Parliament, where actually there was this refusal to think secularism or secularity, if you'd like, as something that would encompass and make space to religions, that the state would not be a reflection of the society, that society cannot be the best representative actually for the state, but rather it had to be reversed, that the state need to be the model for society. It likes like a project of repression for society, to repress the existence and the expression of difference. And difference, obviously, in a secular state is religion by definition. So interestingly enough, it's not only like an indifference to translation or an apathy, it's, as you said it, an opposition, to be against translation, taking back the title of your article. Being against translation is like being against ethics, being against difference, being against justice. So what could be more untranslational than this?
Very well put. Absolutely. I mean, to me, it was really such a, when our viewers don't know this because you don't follow Quebec politics, I don't imagine. But what was particularly horrifying about this legislation was that they made little pictures of what was permissible and what was not permissible. It was it really was very redolent of a kind of Nazi idea of conforming to some sort of ideal, even though, of course, I shouldn't exaggerate, because, of course, this is some kind of notion of laïcité, and which has become a kind of a universalist French idea as well, very much taken. But I totally agree with you that what we want to look for is a proliferation of differences. The more differences, the better. So when we talk about translation, you just spoke about multiplicity of differences. So what translation teaches us is that everything is about difference. You just said translation engenders differences. So we know that at the very, the most basic level, a translation is never a sameness. It's a sameness with a small difference. That small difference is a good thing. All the differences that are engendered through translation take thought further. We're back to Barbara Cassin. Each reiteration of thought in a different language is a translation which takes thought further. So to be afraid of differences, those very small differences which accumulate, because that's what's also fascinating about translation, is the differences between small and big. So translation is all about small differences. It's about small variations in meaning as you're, it's being confronted always with measuring, gauging. Is this, how big, how different? And these are fascinating questions, but these, and they are questions which should not inspire fear and should not inspire putting up fences, but rather should inspire a way of thinking, more, of seeing these differences as positive. And that's the same, when we come down to the differences of the way people look. So people could look different, people, but always in a perspective of openness, as you say, of openness to difference and social justice. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely agree with all this. It could be very odd for our audience to think, why would I be interested in religious studies, for example, or it's obviously they would think that it's because of my own religion that I'm interested in religious studies, but it's not that. It really comes from my interest to translation. For me, the religion today in our secular dominant environment is different, in really as by definition. So to translate this non-secular ethos for me into the dominant secular idiom is an act of justice. To do this translation is an act of justice by way of recognizing their difference as they represent themselves and their citizenship. Because the problem is that if we think that religions or people, belonging to these religions, are put away from, public discourse, from political implication and activism in society. The implication of, casting them aside from society is like, retrieving from them their citizenship, and this is, scandalous in a democratic society. So I think that everyone has right, to be and as he or she wants to be and live. So in that sense, I think that, we definitely, there are many voices that are unheard and we cannot hear, especially coming from the South. But in our democratic societies, we need not to forget that there are also voices that are barely heard, and that, this effort of bringing them to the fore, for example, I admire the work that has been done by someone like Jürgen Habermas in that sense, speaking about, this proviso of translation, where actually he encourages both sides, secular and non-secular people, to actually translate each other so that there could be a real bridge, a real civic being, which is society, democratic society that is really collaborating and cooperating towards the common good. And this is one of my kind of works, actually, to kind of emphasize this and bring this this thought into translation studies, and somehow widen the the conceptual research within translation studies to to give room for this kind of thinking and this kind of conceptualization. So I don't know. We're kind of concluding there. I'm not sure if you had some concluding remarks, Sherry. Before I think I see Salvatore coming in.
By all means,
Maybe
Sherry, if you've got
time to
I'm
listen to
actually,
others.
Glad to go on to questions if there are any.
There
Sure.
are 3 or 4 questions, which is why I interrupted you, because I'd really like there to be enough space to address these questions. Juliana, please.
Here I am. Here I am with a couple of questions, but they are quite long, and especially the second one, which is composed by lots of question marks inside. So I read series first, and then I'll go through the questions that Karen said asks.
And Cobus, hooray.
Sorry?
And Cobus as well.
And Cobus as well,
Yep.
which just came. Okay. Thank you. It came while I was speaking, so thank you, Salvatore. So Siri says, the main principles are very important and central for translation, but isn't there a lack of conflict? It seems to me that ambivalence could be another principle that would include conflict.
I think Sherry might have a problem with her connection at the moment. If we could just wait for her to unfreeze.
Yes.
Perhaps if Monica could contact her and see if...
Yeah, sorry. Is there something I can do from here?
So would you like me to maybe kind of just, I mean, I'd like to remind Siri that Sherry addressed this this notion of conflict, I think with the Bridge of Mostar. And I think ambivalence, there is more than ambivalence. I think the very condition of translation, we said, it's this disconnect and conflict that is at the basis of any, translational movement and impetus, if you'd like. So ambivalence obviously is, can be added to those to these preconditions to translation. Absolutely. Sherry, are you there?
I think Sherry is still frozen.
Okay.
She seems to be moving from one room to another. I think she's looking for a slightly stronger Wi-Fi signal.
I guess so.
Shall we? Okay.
Sherry's back now.
I'm moving, but
Okay. Have you heard the question?
it's about, are we still talking about conflict?
Yeah.
I tried to remind the audience of your of what you said, about the Mostar Bridge.
Yes, I think. Thank you, Siri, for your comment. But I think that conflict is very much at the base of what we both have to say, and I think that especially this question of religion that Salah brought up is there's clearly a problem of conflict, and this goes to to the very highest levels of political activity in Quebec. So yes, conflict is I think what became, well, one way of thinking about conflict became very clear to me when in my work on the city, where I talk about different zones of the city. So there are zones where there is, I think that's a good way of thinking about connections, some connections that work, some connections that don't work. And if you place these connections in a spatial relationship, and you say, okay, here are zones which work, here are zones where there are blockages. That's a useful way of integrating conflict into this conversation.
So I'll go through what Caroline Shred says, and it's quite long, so I'll read it all, and then you tell me whether you would prefer me to split all these questions into many questions. So Caroline says, thank you both for a great exchange. Does connection, inverted comma, have a positive connotation that elides the ways beyond the desire for translation? Translation is also compelled or imposed. Would relation offer a more neutral term that allows for the different ways we are drawn into or forced into translational thinking? And also, many of the people here may be committed and convinced by translational thinking. However, how would we justify this privileging of translation outside our fields? What is uniquely valuable to translational thinking as a transdisciplinary methodology? There are many questions. So shall I go through them again, or?
Yeah, I think there are two main ones. So one is prefers relation to connection. I think this is something that could be discussed. I agree that there could be perhaps be more nuance. On the other hand, I'd like to address the second one. So I think that and I love the question, so thank you, Carolyn. I love this idea of how does translation serve other disciplines. I remember once when I came across a study of emotions in psychology, that this person who had nothing to do with translation in her work, it was a book that I found just like that, and who used, of course, questions of translatability of emotions across languages as a basis for her own investigation into emotions. So what does translation give you as maybe as a methodology, as a prism, as a lens? I think it's absolutely unlimited in the sense of the way that Chakrabarty dealt with his question of capital, the very notions of the categories that we deal with, the questions of the way we can use translation to understand cities, multilingual cities, and how each layer of history involves an operation of translation, how the very life of the city continues or doesn't continue through translation. Salah, why don't you continue? I think I think it's such a rich question.
Yeah, I mean, the question actually in the language that was raised, it is how to privilege translation outside our discipline. And I think it is, some would think that it would be a kind of imperialistic approach to kind of privilege translation or impose the concept of translation outside our discipline. I think that's not what transdisciplinarity means. Transdisciplinarity means that we decenter ourselves in order to try to apprehend and comprehend other disciplines' conceptualization of translation, because you can find translation, the concept, not only the term, but the concept, sometimes even in other terms, in so many disciplines. And our privilege is being in translation studies and being exposed to this, having this sensibility or disposition to kind of capture translation because of our, translational thinking, to capture translation wherever it is. And it is a privilege that we have, but it's not an imperialistic move in any way. It is not something that we impose. It is something that we go and fetch and look for, as we do if we would be doing, with difference, with alterity in general. I think that is exactly what we do in society, or what we should do in society. We should do it in disciplines as well, which is go and see what is done elsewhere and think of it translationally, and enrich ourselves with that. I don't think about Bildung, otherwise. So it is not something that we impose. I think we something that we just bring to us. We bring home.
I would thank you, Salah. I would also like to say, lest our conversation may have led you to think otherwise. Both Salah and I are quite involved, kind of on the terrain. I have organized some events at my university involving translation of Arabic, and which, as we know, has some, at the level of minorities in civic situations. Arabic can be a contested language. And Salah came to these events and contributed some very wonderful thinking. Salah is also involved, in his own community, and has been involved in at really very much at the civic level in these struggles for minority expression within Quebec. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
There is a quite direct question by Cobus Murray, and is, why do liberal, inverted commas, liberal societies tend to become as tyrannical as the tyrannies they resisted? It's a huge question.
Yeah.
Whether it is a real question or just a comment, but there is a question.
Yes. The only thing I would, the only angle that I would try to propose here would be the one that kind of introduces Quebec as a very interesting example of a society which has had a very confused conception of its own identity. So we're sort of both assuming a victim and a victor perspective on its own position within North America, within the Canadian Federation, with its own relation to minorities within the society. So this is a constantly evolving situation. One of the other areas which is really absolutely fascinating in Canada and Quebec now is the new recognition of Indigenous languages, so long forced to translate themselves into Canadian society, into Quebec society, and which now are increasingly become vocal and recognized as voices of their own. And the new expressions of Indigenous populations in both Canada and in Quebec now are absolutely radically redefining the way that these societies see themselves. recently there have been some incredible, very dramatic changes at the level of the Federation in Canada, echoed in Quebec at the Quebec level, all of these having very profound translational implications and imposing a new definition of Quebec society in relation to its history as a victor and not as a victim. So that's just a comment on Cobus's comment, but thank you.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I have my own quick answer to this, or a comment maybe as well. I think that for the specific case of Quebec, I mean, you need to just you know, to resituate Quebec, which is a francophone society that is in the ocean of Anglophone North America, and you know, this situation of minority, linguistic minority within Canada and within North America in general, you know, has kind of built a lot, you know, in time, a kind of complex, I think, that at some point, you know, kind of was returned against its own minorities. And this tyranny, if you'd like to call it this way, I think is to be contextualized in the general situation of Quebec in North America. So I think this is maybe a way to understand the situation of Quebec, but more generally, I mean, because the comment was made, or the question comment was made, you know, about liberal societies in general, I think there is also some temptation to laziness, because what I've been talking about all the time is that translation cannot happen haphazardly. This is something that needs to be willful. That's something to be, you know, engaged for, you know, with an ethical impetus. Without this, nothing happens. So a temptation to laziness, which brings a temptation, another temptation, which is self-confinement, which is against translation again. So these why I'm talking about temptation, because it is if you'd like, if again speaking in the terms of physics that Cobus likes to likes to propose all the time as a model, I think it's that would be the physics of societies that, you know, kind of how do you say that, that would afford, you know, this laziness and self-confinement, or indulge into it. I think it's an indulgence rather than anything else. So, and by the way, generalizations are very dangerous, and I would not go too much into this direction, because despite all the tyranny that you see at Cobus, I think there are a lot of translators or citizen translators everywhere in the world, even in the most tyrannical societies that you may find. That's my optimism, at least.
If there are no other questions, I suggest that we break a little bit early and gird our loins for the final plenary session, where I think we can take up lots and lots of the themes that have been touched on over the past 2 days. So I would like to personally thank Sherry and Salah for an absolutely fascinating conversation. And I'll see you all at the plenary session in about 20 minutes or so. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.